The last letter. The night was sinking deeper into silence. The air reeked of gunpowder, and the stillness of the battlefield hinted at an approaching storm. From afar, the thunder of cannons echoed across the dark sky, and the ground trembled with every blast. Inside a torn tent, a young English soldier, William, sat under the dim flicker of a lantern, bent over a piece of paper. His face was scarred with dust and dried blood, yet his eyes carried an unusual calm. With trembling hands, he clutched the pen. He knew this might be the last letter of his life. A flood of memories. Before writing the first line, a storm of memories overwhelmed him. He thought of his mother's smile, that smile which could heal any wound. He remembered her bedtime stories, the way she wrapped him in prayers before sleep. William's hands trembled, and 2 tears rolled down, staining the paper. He wrote, "Mother, if this letter ever reaches you, know that your son will now only live in your prayers." The reality of war. William gripped the pen tightly and continued writing. "This war, Mother, it is merciless. Every day hundreds of soldiers fall. Some are pierced by bullets, some burned alive in explosions. And those who survive, they die from the inside. We are all far from home, but no heart here is at peace." Suddenly, a shot cracked outside his tent. William froze for a moment, then sighed deeply and went on writing. "Mother, if you ever wonder how your son died, remember, in my final breath I was thinking of you." A soldier's dream. He went on, "I had wished to return, to see my homeland again, to rest in my mother's lap. But now I know that wish will remain only a dream. Still, I want the world to learn one truth. Victory doesn't come through guns, but through peace." The pen slipped slightly from his hand, but he pressed on. "Mother, I pray that the children who come after us grow up in a world where war exists only in books, not in reality." The last tear. When the letter was complete, William folded it carefully and placed it inside his uniform pocket. Suddenly, a deafening blast shook the earth. His tent ripped apart, smoke engulfed everything. William clutched the paper to his chest, closed his eyes, and a faint smile touched his lips. In his final vision, he saw his mother, hands raised in prayer. A silent witness. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with bodies. William's was among them, his lifeless hand still gripping the letter, stained with his tears. Days later, when soldiers gathered the belongings of the fallen, the letter was discovered by an officer. He read it, and his own eyes filled with tears. That letter was eventually delivered to William's mother. A mother's eyes. When she opened it, she pressed the paper against her heart. She wept, yet within her grief was a quiet pride. My son may have died in war, but he prayed for peace. From that day onward, her every prayer ended with a single plea. God, grant this world the peace my son once dreamed of. And so, an ordinary soldier left behind an extraordinary message, through a final letter to his mother. War destroys men, but peace keeps humanity alive. William's mother pressed the letter against her chest, eyes closed. Her tears would not stop, yet a strange calm began to flow through her heart. She kept running her fingers across the paper, as if she could still feel her son's touch upon it. In that moment, she felt he was still with her, his smile, his voice, his innocence, all alive within those words. But her heart wrestled with another war. She thought, my son gave his life, but will the world ever see peace? Or will this thirst for blood never end? A mother's decision. Villagers often saw her sitting for hours, holding the letter, whispering prayers. At first, they thought grief had driven her mad. But slowly, the letter became a message, a living voice. She began teaching every child orphaned by war how to read and write. She would say, "My son dreamed that children should grow up in a world where war exists only in books, not reality. I will not let that dream die." The journey of the letter. Time passed. William's letter was no longer confined to his mother's hands. She made copies and shared them with the villagers. Soon, the letter reached towns, then newspapers, and eventually spread across the entire country. Every person who read it felt their eyes sting with tears. People said, "This is not just the letter of a soldier, it is the voice of humanity." A spark of change. Years later, when the drums of another war began to beat, many young men refused to enlist. They had all read William's words. They said, "We will change the world not with bullets, but with pens." The message even reached the halls of power. Leaders began to debate whether peace at the negotiation table was stronger than bloodshed on the battlefield. And all of it had started with one fragile piece of paper, a letter from a son to his mother. William was buried under the rubble of war, but his dream lived on. The letter his mother held in trembling hands became a light, one that touched countless hearts and changed the course of lives. And the mother would often say, "My son did not die. He lives in every heart that longs for peace." Decades later, years had passed. William's mother was long gone, but her journey with her son's letter had not ended. Copies of it were preserved in libraries, schools, and homes. Time had yellowed the edges of the paper, yet the words still carried the power to move hearts. One day, in a crowded university lecture hall, a young student, Edward, stood at the podium. In his hand was a fragile piece of paper, worn with age. It was William's letter, passed down to his family through generations. Edward read aloud, "Victory doesn't come through guns, but through peace." The hall fell silent. Some students wept quietly, others felt a spark of courage ignite within them. The rise of a movement. From that day, a new era began. Young men and women vowed to wield only knowledge, dialogue, and the written word as their weapons. Newspapers began publishing William's letter again. Public rallies echoed with its message. And slowly, a peace movement was born. People started calling it the Last Letter Movement. It spread beyond one nation. Across borders, in lands still scarred by war, the words reached young hearts. Even amidst the fire of conflict, the letter carried the cool breath of hope. A test of faith. But every movement must face resistance. The powerful, those who profited from war, dismissed it. They sneered. "This is nothing more than a soldier's weak dream. The world is ruled by strength, not words." Edward answered firmly, "If a single letter can change thousands of hearts, then this is not weakness. It is the greatest strength of all." The crowd erupted, chanting, "William's dream lives on." Generations carry the flame. Years rolled by. Under Edward's leadership, treaties were signed, wars were halted, and countless lives were saved. And every time he would remind people, "This victory belongs not to me, but to a mother's tears and a son's final letter." The letter became a symbol. Children memorized its lines in schools. Parents told it to their children before bed. History books preserved it as a turning point in mankind's struggle for peace. The eternal letter. Time marched on. Wars still came, but each time blood was spilled, people returned to William's words. They would ask themselves, "Is peace truly possible?" And the answer always returned, "Yes, if we never let this dream die." William's story was no longer just about one man. It had become the story of generations. His final letter was no longer a piece of paper. It was an eternal voice. And the world remembered, war buries men, but peace makes them immortal. A century later, 100 years had passed since William's sacrifice. The world had changed. Cities had risen, technology had advanced, and nations had learned to speak through treaties instead of trenches. Yet, deep in a small museum, inside a glass case, William's original letter still rested, fragile, faded, but alive. On a quiet afternoon, a group of schoolchildren stood before the display. Their teacher pointed and said, "This letter is not just history, it is a reminder that peace is stronger than war." One little girl pressed her tiny hand against the glass and whispered, "Thank you, William, you saved us all." The global voice. By now, William's words had been translated into dozens of languages. His message lived in songs, poetry, films, and even in the speeches of leaders. Whenever nations stood at the edge of conflict, someone would always rise and say, "Remember the last letter," and the world would pause. The memory of one soldier's dream became the conscience of humanity, the flame of hope. But peace was never perfect. New wars always threatened, shadows always lingered. Yet each time, the last letter reappeared like a flame in the dark, refusing to be extinguished. It had become more than ink on paper. It was a living soul, carried in the hearts of millions who believed that even in the darkest night, dawn was possible. The legacy lives on. Generations had passed, but William was never forgotten. His name was carved not on a gravestone alone, but in the hearts of all who longed for peace. The mother who once wept alone in her cottage could never have imagined that her son's words would ripple through centuries, shaping the very destiny of mankind. The last letter was no longer a relic of war. It had become a covenant, a promise between humanity and its future. And as the world moved forward, people repeated William's words like a prayer. Victory doesn't come through guns, but through peace. And thus, William lived forever, not in the soil of the battlefield, but in the eternal heartbeat of hope. 2 centuries later, 200 years had passed since William wrote his final words. The world now looked unrecognizable. Skies filled with iron birds, machines walking on the moon, and voices carried across oceans in seconds. But despite the marvel of progress, humanity still wrestled with its oldest enemy, war. Borders still bled, greed still whispered, and power still blinded rulers. Yet, through it all, the last letter remained, a fragile voice against the roar of violence. Inside the World Peace Museum, people lined up daily, not just to see William's letter, but to feel it. Some touched the glass with trembling hands, others bowed in silence, and some broke into tears. It was no longer just a letter, it was a scripture of hope. The digital flame. One day, an idea was born. A group of young dreamers decided to take William's letter beyond paper and ink. They turned it into a living digital flame, a light that could never fade. Projected in city squares, glowing on screens, whispered through headphones, and translated instantly into every language, William's words became eternal. Victory doesn't come through guns, but through peace. No censorship could erase it, no tyrant could silence it, and no wall could contain it. The flame spread faster than any army ever could, across borders, across generations, across hearts. The challenge of the future. But darkness never rests. New leaders, hungry for power, tried to bend humanity back into the chains of fear. They declared, "The world survives by force, not peace." And once again, the last letter was tested. Would it fade into forgotten pages or rise stronger than ever? A young girl named Amelia, a descendant of William's family, stood before millions at the United Nations. In her trembling hands, she held the original letter, yellowed but breathing. Her voice carried across the world. "If my ancestors' words could survive 2 centuries of blood and fire, then we have no excuse to abandon them now. Guns end lives, but peace gives life eternity." The hall erupted into thunderous applause. The eternal oath. From that moment, nations took a vow called the Oath of the Last Letter. It was simple yet powerful. We will fight only ignorance, hunger, and despair, never each other. The oath spread from governments to classrooms, from armies to families. Soldiers began carrying the last letter inside their uniforms, not as an order of war, but as a shield of conscience. Final ending, Part 5. Centuries had changed everything, the way humans lived, spoke, and dreamed. But William's words had outlived kings, wars, and empires. The last letter was no longer history. It was no longer even memory. It had become destiny. And so, as the world stood on the threshold of new centuries, humanity remembered a single truth. War buries men, but peace makes them immortal. And William lived on forever.